Well, welcome, folks. I think we have a critical mass, and I think we should get started. My name is Chet Kerr. I'm on the board of the Irvington Historical Society, and I want to welcome everybody here today to this presentation we're doing about the Gilded Age in Irvington, interesting stories and interesting folks. A couple of preliminary things before we get to start with the presentation. First, we're recording today's presentation, and we'll be putting it up on our website later this week once we're done. Two, if anybody has any questions as we go along or at the end, we're going to have a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, and you can put your questions in the chat, and when I'm done presenting, I'll try to go through those and answer them as best I can. So with that, why don't we get started? One second. Whoops. Excuse me, folks. Okay, so today we're talking about the Gilded Age, which is a term it's used to describe the tumultuous years between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 20th century. During this time period, the United States became much more prosperous and grew tremendously, and the economy accelerated from being an agrarian economy in the early 1800s to more of an industrial economy, and almost doubled in size. And these changes resulted in a tremendous amount of personal wealth growth, especially around the large cities like New York. And there was an unprecedented growth in industry, transportation, and technology during this time period. But the Gilded Age also had a more complicated and at times sinister side. It was a time for new social movements, both good and bad, and broad changes in American society that took hold of our country, such as increases in immigration, demands for women's suffrage, changes in civil rights, and expansions of Jim Crow, and the embrace of social Darwinism, which was used to justify the great wealth gap between the wealthy and the poor. And it was also during this time where there were a number of greedy and corrupt industrialists, bankers, and politicians who enjoyed extraordinary wealth and opulence, often at the expense of the working class. And so American society changed dramatically, and these changes could be seen on both a national and on a local scale. And the name of the Gilded Age was coined by Mark Twain in a 1873 book he wrote with Charles Dudley Warner entitled The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. And it was a novel and satirized the greed and the political corruption in post-Civil War America. They took the name from William Shakespeare's King John, which described the excessive step of gilding gold. So you had gold, which was this fabulously wonderful stuff, and then they would gild it to make it even more special. And that reflected, I think, in certain ways, the approach that people look back at the Gilded Age, where the wealthy and the very opulent parts of our society really tried to come to the fore. And it was also a period of real social criticism. This is a cartoon by Thomas Nast, and we're going to talk about Thomas Nast a little later on when we talk about Fletcher Harper. But it was during this time, both the expansion of newspapers and of periodicals that used and put in place cartoons by a lot of cartoonists and caricatures, including Thomas Nast, and they were used to tell stories, and they were very potent, powerful stories. And if you think about today, that's also being used today in different ways through social media and the like. You know, one thing I think is really interesting is, as we talk about things today, about the Gilded Age, is to think about how some of these same forces are at play in today's world, where we have some of the same social disruptions and social pressures going on. And this is a cartoon by Nast. And it was called "Who Stole the People's Money?" It was in the New York Times, and everybody is pointing to the person on the right, the fat, large person on the left. That's Boss Tweed, and many of you know Boss Tweed was a leading Democratic politician in New York State at the time, very corrupt individual and very famous for his corruption. And the Gilded Age's complicated legacy could be seen here in Irvington as well. Irvington was a relatively new community in the late 1800s, and the transformational forces that were at play across society also presented themselves here in Irvington. And the number of residents and the diversity of its local business community grew steadily, reflecting the greater accessibility to New York City and the growing embrace of what was called suburban living. It was a new way of having people who had traditionally been in large cities move out because of the access to outer areas due to greater transportation. That allowed them to live in a very different way. And during this period, the area from Yonkers to Tarrytown was described in the Peterson magazine as the richest colony in the world because of its extensive summer estates owned by the wealthy elite of New York. According to the June 1897 Peterson magazine, the old Albany Post Road, which is Broadway, along that, about 15 miles of that, there were estates of families whose aggregate wealth reached the enormous sum of $1,023 million in 1897, which was about $37 billion today. So in that 15-mile stretch, there were homes and families who in aggregate had a tremendous amount of wealth. And as I say, in today's world, you can see tech entrepreneurs who have made billions. They're in the news and the subject of public fascination. And they own big yachts. They build rocket ships and try to go to the Mars. And in many ways, their world is very removed from the rest of ours. And that was emblematic of the Gilded Age. And it was emblematic of the Gilded Age in part in Irvington as well. On the left is the image of the certificate of the incorporation of the village of Irvington. Irvington was originally formed in 1850 as a hamlet, but it was formally incorporated in April of 1872, and that brought more of a structure and a governmental structure to the community. So right now, we have the Historical Society has been putting on an exhibit at the McVickar House called The Gilded Age, and the exhibit traces the lives of several of Irvington's families while highlighting the Society's collection from the period and offering examples of the conspicuous consumption that was practiced by the social elite at the time. And this picture is a very famous picture. It's a photograph of Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt, also known as Elvra Murray Smith, as a Venetian princess at the Vanderbilt Ball in 1883. Miss Vanderbilt was a very, very socially ambitious woman, and she was very anxious to break into New York's high society and get on the list. And what the list was the famous list of 400 people who were New York society's high society of the Gilded Age. But to get on the list, you had to work your way through the kind of the queen bee of the social hierarchy at the time, Mrs. Carolyn Shiverhorn Astor, also known as the Mrs. Astor. And the Astors had decided several years before that the Vanderbilt family was unacceptable for high society because the patriarch, Cornelius Commander Vanderbilt, was kind of crass and distasteful. And this really upset Elva. So she had this big elaborate plan to get herself back on the list or onto the list. She had married Vanderbilt's grandson, and they had built this beautiful, beautiful large mansion on Fifth Avenue, which they called the Petit Chateau. And so she threw this enormous party for New York's elite. And it was a kind of a Venetian dress-up party. And everybody came, very famous, and she actually got her way back on the list. And that was, I think, an example of the kinds of behavior that some of the very rich were going through as they jockeyed themselves for social position and business positions as well. So today, what we're going to talk about is kind of building from some of the things that are in that exhibit, but talk about some stories of individuals who lived here in Irvington in the late 1890s. This is a map from 1891, and it's a map of Irvington. And we're going to talk today about these individuals: James Fargo, Carolyn Amelia Shields Rubera, Georgie Dearman, Fletcher Harper and Fletcher Harper Jr., and then Thomas Burns, William Murray, and John McCullough. So why these folks? Well, I find them incredibly interesting people, and I hope you do as well. But I think they're interesting both in their own right, but also because of how they reflect some of these forces that were at play in the Gilded Age, both nationally and in Irvington itself. And so as we go through, and I'll go through them one by one, tell a little bit about their stories, where they lived, how they lived, think about how those forces come into play. So we're going to start with James Congdell Fargo. And this is a portion of the map I just showed, which shows James Fargo's 38-acre estate. It was in the northwest corner of the village of Irvington. The red line on the right is Broadway, the train track, and the water on the left, that's Hudson River. That's Sunnyside Lane. So Fargo's property was right below Sunnyside Lane, just below Washington Irving's Sunnyside estate. James Fargo started from very kind of humble beginnings. He was born in Waterville, New York in 1829, the seventh son of a family of 12 children. And after attending school, he went to work in Buffalo at the age of 15. He only attended school to about the age of 14 or so, and went to work in the office of his brother, William G. Fargo, who operated an express line from Albany to Buffalo. And we're going to talk for a second about the express business, because I think it reflects some of the dramatic changes that were going on in the United States, and changes in business and industry. And so going back to the early 1800s, mail delivery was subject to a monopoly of the U.S. Postal Service, but both the package and the banking businesses were largely unregulated, and there was no real control over them and no regimented industry for that. And in 1839, a young man named William Hardin, who lived in Boston, began to see that ships were coming over from Europe, would stop in Boston, and captains would be asked to bring with them packages that would have to be then delivered to various folks in the United States around the Northeast. And there's no real way of doing that. And he thought, aha, that's a way I could build into business and make some money. And so he started the first package express business in 1839 between Boston and New York. And at that time, I don't even think the railway had been built between Boston and New York as of yet. So a lot of the initial express business was done over horseback or through carriage. And so ships would arrive in the Boston harbor. The captains who had these little packages would reach out to Hardin. Hardin would then arrange to have those packages delivered across the Northeast. And in 1854, Hardin's company was merged into the Adams Express Company, which was one of the larger express companies by that point on the East Coast. And this is an advertisement. And as you'll see, one things they sold themselves as doing was delivering not only packages, but banknotes, gold and silver coins, parcels and packages and freights, and et cetera. So, and this express business grew and slowly began to reach nationwide. And there were a number of competing express services between different cities, and they kind of grew rapidly. And in 1850, three men, Henry Wells, William Fargo, who was the older brother of James Fargo, who we're talking about here in Irvington, and John Butterfield consolidated several express companies to form the American Express Company, which reached between New York City, Albany, Buffalo, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis. And at that time, the trains did not go all the way out to Chicago. So they would go out a certain distance west, and then you'd have to, through package delivery or stagecoach or horseback, you bring it the rest of the way. But slowly those rail systems grew, but a lot of this stuff was done by carriage. And after having started the big American Express Company, Henry Wells and William Fargo also realized that because of the discovery of gold in California, there was a real opportunity to start an express business in California as well. And they proposed to the board of American Express to do so. And the board of American Express said, no, we're not going to do that. John Butterfield was very much against it. So Henry Wells and William Fargo said, okay, we'll start on our own. We'll start Wells Fargo and Company to operate as an express company in California and connect. And they would then send packages by ship down the Pacific, cross over the isthmus in Panama, take ship back up to New York, and then they would connect up with the American Express systems on the East Coast. And at its inception, the Wells Fargo and Company offered banking services, which included gold and delivery of gold, buying gold, selling paper drafts, along with its normal express business. And it proved very, very successful. So going back to James Fargo, as I said, he started off working for his brother in Buffalo as a young man. And he, started off as a clerk, sweeping floors, running errands, and moving up to delivering money packages around the city. But in 1847, he moved to Detroit and was eventually promoted to be the superintendent of Wells Express business at that time in Michigan. And then, as I mentioned, in 1850, American Express was formed and by his older brother. And in 1855, James Fargo moved to Chicago to take charge of the American Express Company Chicago office. So he was a relatively young man, but that's a very large job, being put in charge of it. And he demonstrated a tremendous amount of skills at doing this. And in 1867, he moved to New York to become the general superintendent over all of the American Express Company lines. And he was also named as a director of Wells Fargo and Company, which was a separate company being run by his brother. And the image on the left is a very famous image. One of the things that American Express really sold was that it could guarantee delivery of very valuable packages. And that guard dog on top of the American Express packaging was a famous image they used to demonstrate to consumers that you could trust American Express. And so American Express began this kind of network. They would open offices throughout many, many cities. There was actually an American Express office at the base of Main Street in Irvington for a period of time. And they would deliver packages, often by carriage or by horseback, and just kind of got larger and larger. And they were very innovative in what they were doing. They created an order and a commission department, which is very similar to kind of modern business-to-business service that you think of as Federal Express or DHL or whatever. And its agents had access to a large selection of suppliers, and the companies would ask American Express agents to go out and purchase supplies for them, then American Express would deliver them. And it was a way of really integrating themselves with the broader growing industry that was growing across the United States. So James Fargo, he had moved to New York to become the superintendent of all of the American Express lines. And his older brother, William Fargo, was at that time the president of American Express. William Fargo died in 1881, and American Express named James Fargo to become the president of American Express Company. And he held that position for 33 years, quite a long time. And that was a time where he had this large summer estate in Irvington. He was also the president of the Merchants Dispatch Transportation Company, which had been formed to operate as a fast freight company over the New York Central lines, highlighting the relationship between the expanding express business and the growing reach of the railroads across the country in the Gilded Age. And that, something I want to stop here. I think this really reflects how these different businesses and different industries were starting to build on each other as the reach of transportation and communications expanded across the country in the second half of the 19th century. It was quite remarkable. And it also shows the close ties of American Express Company and Wells Fargo. Interestingly, today you think of those as very separate companies. Wells Fargo more of a bank, American Express is a financial services company. But they were both express companies, and they had very intermingled boards of directors and officers, and they were connected and feeding packages back and forth. Henry Wells he was the president of American Express between 1850 and 1868, and he was a founder and director of Wells Fargo from 1852 to 1868. William Fargo, who was James Fargo's older brother, he was the president of American Express from 1868 to 1881, and he was a founder and director of Wells. He was a president of Wells Fargo for a couple of years in there as well. And then James Fargo, who lived here in Irvington, he was the president of American Express from 1881 to 1914. And through much of that time period, he was also director of Wells Fargo as well. And there are many other connections to Wells Fargo and American Express in Irvington. Edward G. Morgan, who was the older brother of George D. Morgan, who owned the Willowbrook estate here in New York along North Broadway. He was the first president of Wells Fargo. Danforth Barney and Ashbel Barney, both of whom lived on the Barney estate just south of the old Main Street area of Irvington. They served as officers and directors of Wells Fargo. William Fogg, who lived on North Broadway, also served as a longtime director of Wells Fargo. And I think it's interesting that so James Fargo in many ways reflected the interconnectivity of business leaders across different companies working on different boards, and the kind of the social aspect of this. He often would have summer estates in the same communities as the Barneys and the Foggs. And again, in many ways, it reflects how some of high-end entrepreneurs operate today. They often operate on different companies' boards. They support each other. They know each other socially, and it becomes part of the reality of successful business. James Fargo was also a very innovative man. He started the first express money order that was used by these express services. In 1864, the United States Postal Service had inaugurated the money order as a way of transmitting money through the mails. And in one second, I'm going to check one thing here. And in 1882, James Fargo told one of his employees, Marcellus F. Berry, that he wanted a form of an express money order that could not be raised. Now, what it meant to raise a money order is that somebody would go in and fraudulently change the money order to increase the amount. So what Berry came up with was a form that listed on the left-hand side the different money amounts of the order. And the agent, when the order was placed, would tear it off. So it would put an upper limit of how much money that money order reflected. And that way it could be for a specific amount, the amount couldn't be raised, and then somebody could take that and go to another either express company or a bank and get the money drawn on it. Okay. Another big innovation that James Fargo did was the American Express traveler's check. In 1890, he traveled to Europe and had difficulty in getting money on his letters of credit. He returned to the United States and again asked his employee Marcellus Berry to come up with a foolproof check that would be negotiable. And Berry's design featured a counter signature system and a watermark. And he came up with the idea that everybody's signature is somewhat unique, and that by signing it when you bought the traveler's checks, then re-signing it when you attempted to cash them, that way you could be assured that the right person was cashing the check. And I remember using traveler's checks when I was first started traveling. They're not really probably used as much anymore, but this was tremendously a successful business for American Express and expanded its business worldwide extensively. And originally the value of American Express traveler's checks were only expressed in dollars or pounds sterling or francs or lira, but they eventually grew into other currencies as well. And American Express famously agreed to make good on any check, even if stolen or forged. And it was said before long that American Express traveler's checks was better in some countries than gold. They were just so solid, and so people had such confidence in them. And again, this was an innovation that James Fargo, our Irvington resident, came up with. So thinking about James Fargo as a reflection of the Gilded Age, a couple of points. He started off as a 15-year-old clerk, and he built his career and fortune based on the rapid expansion and changes in transportation, banking, and package delivery systems. He basically rode the expansion of our economy across the country as it grew up in the late 1800s. His success was tied to the growth of an interconnected national economy. He was a very innovative guy and came up with new financial products that reflected the needs of that changing economy. Like many other very successful businessmen in the Gilded Age, he had close ties to other men in the railroad and shipping businesses. And let me just stop here. A lot of we're going to talk about, we're not talking just about men, but the reality was in the Gilded Age that much of the business was being done by men and not by women. That is a reflection of history. And although described as a singularly quiet and unostentatious and habited manner, he still maintained a 4-story brownstone on East 37th Street and a 40-acre summer estate in Irvington. And he, in many ways, reflects the wide wealth and wealth inequality nationwide and with Irvington itself. And so I think in many ways that part of James Fargo reflects some of the dynamics of the Gilded Age. So let's look at our second person, Caroline Amelia Shields Caldwell Rubera. And this is again, from the map I showed you at the start, this is shows the Rubera estate called El Retiro. And just sort of put that in position, the solid line going through, that's the aqueduct, the pink line's Broadway. The line, the kind of dash line at the top of El Retiro, that is where Station Road is today. So this large estate was, if you went along Station Road, went through the tunnel, it would be right on the left as you came through the tunnel going toward the river. It was actually reached by a road from the south coming from what is today Dow's Lane. And El Retiro Lane in Irvington is what leads up to the property that was Caroline Rubera's El Retiro estate. So Caroline Amelia Shields was born in Mobile, Alabama in 1846, the daughter of a steamboat captain. And she could trace her history back to the Revolutionary War. So she was a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution. Through her mother, she could trace herself back to I think it was New Jersey lieutenant who was a very famous lieutenant in the Jersey militia in the Revolutionary War. She, I think, spent most of her early years in childhood in Mobile, Alabama, and this was in Alabama pre-Civil War, so a large slave-owning community. And she lived there during the Civil War. And in 1864, and at the age of 18, she married Edward Holland Caldwell, who came from a very prosperous Southern family. Edward Caldwell was described as a man of very large means, who lived the life of a prosperous Southern gentleman of antebellum days. And let's get this out of here, Vic. Okay. And he was also apparently involved with the Confederacy and probably a slave owner. And after the Civil War, was able to continue his career as the president of the Mobile Gas, Light, and Coke Company after receiving a pardon from President Andrew Johnson. And the reason why he was connected to that is because his father, James Henry Caldwell, had immigrated from England to the United States and ended up in New Orleans. And he was a big real estate developer and built a bunch of large theaters across the South. But he also started the New Orleans Gas Light Company, which illuminated the early streets of New Orleans with gas. And he opened franchises in Mobile, Alabama, Cincinnati, Memphis, and other cities as well. And his son, Edward Caldwell, took on the presidency of that and after he received his pardon. And next slide. This is a copy of the pardon that Caldwell got from Andrew Johnson after the war. And it required him to swear an oath of allegiance to the United States. And then the pardon would become void if he at any time acquired any property whatsoever in slaves or made use of slave labor, which was verboten under this. Okay, one second. Let me just get this. Change my slide. Okay. So this is an image of El Retiro, Carolyn Ribera's estate in Irvington, and it kind of reflects a very large, beautiful house. This house had been built by Morris Jessup about 20 years before, but it was very, very beautiful grounds of her estate. And actually, the area of El Retiro had been designed under Jessup's guidance by Ionet's Anton Palet, who was an Australian-born gardener who had migrated to the United States to work on the design and planting of New York Central Park. And in 1863, he became the chief gardener and superintendent of the park, position he retained for the rest of his life. So the El Retiro property, and again, this is, I think, reflection of some of the things in the Gilded Age of the very wealthy at that time, was very designed intentionally. And when the Riberas purchased the property, Caroline Ribera had married, she had been, after her husband, Edward Caldwell, had died in 1872, and she then married Santos Ribera, who was a Spanish importer-exporter, and they shifted their time between Mobile, Alabama, and New York. And when they purchased this, I think they called it Retiro because it was named after the Park del Buen Retiro, or the Park of the Pleasant Retreat, which is one of the largest public parks in Madrid, Spain. And you can see from this image of how it was designed when Jessup owned it, it was a very beautiful park-like area. So the one thing the Riberas did when they spent their summers up here was they really blended into the kind of lifestyle of estate lifestyle of New York, and their home was adjacent to many other large estates. And again, going back to the map, you see up on the left was the Barney estate. Carol Dunham had an estate just up on the other side of the aqueduct was Springbrook, which was a summer cottage, so to speak, and that was rented for several years by James Rutter, who was the president of the New York Central Railroad. And the Dows and the Mars had estates right next to hers as well. And so she was very much in the social milieu of Irvington at this time. And in 1885, Bessie Rutter married, who was a daughter of James Rutter, the president of the New York Central Railroad, married A.J. Manning, who was an Irvington architect, and at a very fancy wedding that was held at St. Barnabas. And it was attended by leading citizens, all of Irvington. And A.J. Manning was a well-known architect. He designed Town Hall, and he had also designed Rockroan, which was the 40-room castle built for Melchior Beltzhoover, just north of Halsey Pond, and that was later the Halsey Castle as well. It was here in Irvington to the 60s. And so what this really reflects is that there was a upper crust of Irvington that was perhaps far removed from the everyday folks, merchants and immigrants and workers that lived along Main Street in the village of Irvington. and they were all in many ways interconnected. And in fact, in October 1888, Carolyn Rubera's daughter from her first marriage married Nathaniel Rutter, who was James Rutter's other son, again at St. Barnabas Church, and it was another gigantic Irvington social event. 6 months later, Sarah and Nathaniel Rutter bought their own summer cottage called Bokeham's, which had been part of the Cyrus Field estate, which was down along South Broadway. Tragically, however, in January of 1891, Nathaniel Rutter died suddenly. I think he had pneumonia, leaving Sarah as a young 23-year-old widow with a 1-year-old child. And in certain ways, it reflected Carolyn Rubera's life, because her first husband had died when she was a young woman, like 26. She had 3 young children. And the tragedy that she had faced, now her daughter was facing. And following the death of their son-in-law, the Ruberas never came back to El Retiro. They moved back to Mobile and just never returned, whether it was out of sadness. And El Retiro, the estate, lay kind of dormant for 20 years. It was finally sold at auction in 1812, and the property was split into 2 different parcels. The eastern parcel, right adjacent to the old Croton Aqueduct, the old mansion that the Ruberas had was torn down, and the new owner built a new mansion, which he called Glen Brea. And that still stands today at the northern end of El Retiro Lane in Irvington, and it's now known as Villa Verde. So if you go up El Retiro Lane, you look to your right, you'll see this large hacienda-like gigantic mansion, and that is Villa Verde, where El Retiro was at this time. So again, thinking about Carolyn Amelia Rubera as a reflection of the Gilded Age, in certain ways, she reflected the intersection of pre-Civil War Southern society and the post-Reconstruction era of changing race relations. She and her husband likely owned slaves when they were living in Mobile, Alabama. They didn't do that, but interestingly, in the 1870 census, before Edwin Caldwell died, they're shown as living in Mobile with a wide range of domestic Black servants at the time. So it was still very much a reflection of Southern reality of racial relations. Her home in Irvington was an example of the summer estates and summer cottages that the very wealthy were able to maintain in Lower Hudson Valley. Her property reflected the new sensibility, I think, of landscape architecture and the park-like design incorporated in the homes and lifestyles of the new wealthy suburbia. And another theme of the Gilded Age reflected here in Irvington was efforts by the very wealthy to design these beautiful areas that they could escape to and live in. And I think her life also reflects the close social and family connections of the wealthy landowners in Irvington, and it corresponded to the stratified social structure across much of the United States. Okay, so our next person is George Edward Dearman. A very different kind of person. He was born in 1853. He was the youngest son of George W. Dearman and the grandson of Justice Dearman, both of whom were instrumental in the founding of the new village of Dearman in 1850. And as most of you know, Dearman's name was changed to Irvington in 1854. So this was the very start of Irvington in 1850. And from the map beginning, this is a map of the main street in Irvington, which reflects a very different part of the village during the Gilded Age. And the history of Irvington, the founding of Irvington, is, as some of you know, and if you come to our prior presidents, you do know, the way it began was that Justice Dearman, who was a farmer, he had purchased a 144-acre farm that stretched from the Hudson River almost to the Sawmill River. He bought that in 1812, and he had farmed it for 35 years. But in the late 1840s, 1849 to be exact, the new Hudson Railroad that had gone up the Hudson River from New York City up to Albany opened up. And that opened a whole new vista for people to come up from the city and increase the accessibility of the area in the lower Hudson to New York's residents, including the very wealthy. And there was a gold rush of speculators who came up to try to purchase up some of the older farms. And Justice Dearman saw this as an opportunity, and he ended up selling the western part of his farm, extending from Broadway down to the river, to Gustavus Saatchi, who was a broker in New York. And then Saatchi turned around and flipped it and sold it to Franklin Field, who had this vision of starting this new community. And the reason why they chose this area to start this new village between Tarrytown and Dobbs Ferry was it was across the river from Piermont. And the wharf that extends out from Piermont at the time was the eastern terminus of the Erie Railroad. And so what Franklin Field originally had envisioned was that he would create this new village right across the river. He got the charter to run a ferry system from Piermont over to Irvington. And he was hoping also, in addition to the Hudson River Railroad, which ran up the river, to create a spur from the new hamlet of Dearman over to Portchester to connect up with the railroad leading from New York up to Boston, and thereby creating a way for trains coming from Boston to cross Westchester, come to Dearman, unload their goods onto his ferry system, move it over to Piermont, and get on the Erie Railroad and head out west. And so he had big plans for what Dearman could be. That railroad spur was never built, but the village quickly established itself, and this map shows the lots that Franklin Field had envisioned auctioning off in 1850 to create this new village. And the Dearmans, they had actually, their farmhouse, their original farmhouse was along what is today Broadway, on this very property. And this whole vision of creating this new community, I think reflected, again, a theme of the Gilded Age, creating the new suburban living. And this is an article from the Hudson River Chronicle, which is a newspaper up in Ossining at the time, about this new village of Dearman, and how the proximity of the county of Westchester, New York, and the decided advantages which it possesses as a place of residence for the community of the city over other neighboring counties render it peculiarly beneficial in all points of view, as a resort at all seasons of the year for all classes and descriptions of businessmen. And so I think the dynamics of this new village of Irvington in many ways reflected these broader themes as well. It was a way for both a new everyday business person to come out and live in this new village, but it also would then support larger, wealthier estates of the very wealthy in New York that were expanding up the Hudson Valley. And so for the map I just showed you, this is this shows where the Justice Dearman's farmhouse was. It was now overlaid onto these new plots that were going to be sold. And Justice Dearman, actually Justice Dearman's son, George Dearman, purchased lots 244, 245, 261, 260, 262, and 243, and where his father's house had been. And that house, the dwelling house, still is here in Irvington. It's the oldest house in Irvington. It's the home that's at 130 Main Street, just between Broadway and South Dearman. It's the second house in. It doesn't look anything like it was when it was the Justice Dearman house back in the 1850s, but it still exists. So the sale of the farm and the creation of this new village was both an opportunity and then I think real tragedy for the Dearmans. first, the sale of the farm was a bonanza for the family. Justice Dearman got over $26,000, which is a tremendous sum of money at that time, especially for somebody who spent 35 years farming his land. And as I said, in 1852, his son, George Dearman, purchased an additional lot across Main Street from the Dearman homestead and opened a grocery store there to service the quickly expanding community. And that plot is where today's Shell station is, on the northwest corner of Main Street and Broadway. Tragically, however, in late March of 1855, George Dearman died, leaving his wife and 6 children, 4 of whom were under the age of 12. And he had appointed James Hamilton, who was a lawyer and owned the Nevis estate in now south part of Irvington, as his executor. And Hamilton quickly sold the lot on the northwest corner of Main Street and of Albany Post Road, where George Dearman had opened his grocery store, as well as sold off several other parcels that George Dearman had purchased. Justice Dearman, his father, also died the same year, and he also named James Hamilton as his executor. And the family for years had battles over trying to disputes over Justice Dearman's fortune, who would get what and whatever. And over the next 25 years, George Dearman's wife, Euphemia Dearman, continued to live with her children in the Dearman homestead on South Main Street between 8th Street, which was now South Dearman, and Albany Post Road. And her youngest son, who was George Dearman, who we're talking about now, continued to live at home. And then as he got older, he started working as a grocery clerk for Robert Abercrombie, who owned a separate grocery store down Main Street at 49 Main Street. There's a grocery store at what is today the northeast corner of Main Street and North Dutcher. And the Dearmans were part of this new merchant class who lived along Main Street and slowly expanded. And in about 1880, George Dearman's older brother, Henry Clay Dearman, and his wife Phoebe and their children moved back to Irvington from New York City. Henry Dearman had left Irvington as a young man right before the Civil War, when he was 17, and had kind of lied to get into the Union Army. And he ended up fighting at some of the major battles of the war. He fought at Gettysburg and a lot of other major ones. And then after the war, he and his wife had moved back to New York City, and he had worked as a train conductor for a number of years. But in 1880, he and his wife followed the exodus of, young couples with young kids and moved out to the Irvington. And he got a job working at a grocer that was the Adams Grocery, which was down at the corner of Main Street and at North Astor Place. So this is a picture of the Adams store, actually at a later date, but it's where it was located. And Henry Clay became an apprentice in the store and worked there for a number of years. And George Dearman, in 1882, he formed a partnership with Robert Abercrombie Jr. and took over the grocery store that had been operated by his Robert Abercrombie Sr. at 4951 Main Street. And this is a picture of that store. And for the next 20 years, George Dearman was one of the more successful merchants of Irvington. And again, he was part, unlike the very, very wealthy, like the Ruberas and Fargo, who had these large estates, he lived on Main Street. He ran a store. He was a businessman that supported these large estates. And eventually his older brother, Henry, came to work in the store as well as a clerk in this grocery store. And that became kind of the Dearman's wherewithal in the new village of Irvington. The Dearmans, to make room for Henry's family, what the Dearmans actually sold their homestead in 1886 to Sylvester Buckout, who was a carpenter, a builder, and a lifelong resident of Irvington, who was from the old Buckout family. And Dearman, when he sold it, he kept small parts of his property that was between Broadway and H Street and built two new small adjacent homes. And on this map, which is from 1889, you see Broadway, and then you see Main Street and H Street. And right in the corner of H Street and Main Street, the southeast corner, there's a new yellow house, and behind it a small house. Then to the right, that house just to the right, that was the original Derman house. And so George Derman and his mother and one of his sisters moved into the house right on the corner. And George's brother Henry and his family moved into the house behind it, just down H Street. And those two houses are also still here. The one right on the corner is 126 Main Street. You might have seen it's being renovated right now. But it's, again, one of these older houses from about 1886. So let's think about George Dearman as a reflection of the Gilded Age in a very different way. He and his family reflect the small business opportunities in the expanding suburban world surrounding larger cities. In many ways, his career reflected the steady growth of the village of Irvington as a new and growing community in the lower Hudson Valley. But despite the fact his family were, founders of Irvington, their life along Main Street stands, I think, in real contrast to the wealthy summer estates of the business elite like James Fargo, Carolyn Ribera. They never had a lot of property. They probably worked long hours every day, never had a lot of money. And the gulf between the very wealthy who maintain the large estates and the small business owners who serve those estates highlights some of the economic and social tensions of the Gilded Age. So again, I think it reflects another aspect of how these tensions and these differences appeared in Irvington of the past. So let's turn to our next person, who's Fletcher Harper and Fletcher Harper Jr. And Fletcher Harper was born in 1806 in Newtown, Long Island. After a successful career in publishing, which we'll talk about in a second, he bought Beach Lawn, which was his estate in Irvington in 1872 when he was about 76. And this is a map showing where Beach Lawn is. It was at the corner of West Clinton Avenue and Broadway, between Broadway and the Croton Aqueduct. And today, that's the very northern end of the Nevis estate that's owned by Columbia. For the very end of the northern Nevis estate, you'll see there's a large yellow building where the Columbia Press was. That section of the Nevis estate is where Beach Lawn was owned by Fletcher Harper. His son Fletcher Jr. was born in 1828 and also got involved with the publishing business and took over Beach Lawn after his father's death. So who was Fletcher Harper? Fletcher Harper, was one of the four Harper brothers who started the Harper publishing empire. And this is a picture from about, I think, 1860. And on the left is Fletcher Harper, who lived in Irvington, and then James Harper, John Harper, and Joseph Wesley Harper. These four individuals started the Harper publishing empire. And the Harper family had settled on Long Island before the American Revolution, and the four brothers were reared in kind of a stern and pious Methodist home. After apprenticing with printers in New York City, James and John, the two older brothers, started J&J Harper, a publishing house, in 1817. Their brother Joseph Wesley joined the firm in 1823, and Fletcher Harper joined the firm in 1825. And then in 1833, they changed the name of the firm to Harper and Brothers. And Harper Brothers was a monumental force in the publishing industry, both the beginning parts of 1800s, but more so in the Gilded Age as well, because the firm pioneered practices for the wider publishing industry and had a significant influence on letters, politics, and social commentary throughout the 19th century. And just one example, they were the publishers of Moby Dick, and they had originally turned down Melville's first book, which was Tippy, A Peep at Polynesian Life. They just turned it down, so we're going to pass on it. But it was very successful. And so when Melville's first publisher turned down his next book, Omu, because it criticized Christian missionaries, Melville again approached Harper Brothers about publishing his book. And there's a famous story that when Melville came to knock on the Harper Brothers' door, none of the brothers were there. Fletcher Harper had just left and was in a carriage going to the docks, as he was going to get in a ship and go to Europe. And a clerk ran after his coach and tracked him down and said that Herman Melville's at our offices and wants us to publish his second book. And Fletcher Harper told the clerk to run back quickly and tell Melville will absolutely do it. And on the right is a picture of the agreement between the Harper Brothers and Herman Melville from September of 1851 to publish The Whale, which is what Moby Dick was originally called. The story of Moby Dick is interesting, included some strong criticism of conventional morality and was initially kind of savaged by the critics because of that. But the Harper Brothers stood by their author, and I think that reflects the Harper Brothers' approach to publishing and their commitment to authors that they were putting and willing to be a little pushing the boundaries of what the publishing industry could do at the time. Again, pushing into the tumultuous growth going on in the Gilded Age. And they ended up publishing Moby Dick in 1851. But where the Harper Brothers really made their mark in the United States was through the Harper periodicals. And three that were really run by Fletcher Harper, who owned his estate in Irvington. Harper's New Monthly Magazine, which was first published in 1850. Harper's Weekly, which was first published in 1857. And then Harper's Bazaar, which was first published in 1867. And in the Harper Company, Fletcher Harper was kind of the chief operating officer, and he was the one principally responsible for launching all three of these publications and really nurturing them and bringing them into the fore. So Harper's New Monthly Magazine took on the role of kind of the modern literary magazine. It was one of the first modern literary magazines. And what they did was they found authors and serialized their works on a monthly basis. And it really was a way of introducing authors and their new novels to a wide swath of American society. And this was something that was often widely read and waited for every month to be able to read the next section of a new author's book. Harper's Weekly was launched as kind of a high-class illustrated weekly intended for family reading. And they, again, recognized that as families were in this kind of a new growing class of middle class in certain ways, that people would be interested in reading information on a weekly basis. And it was started as kind of a non-political magazine, but it quickly became a political power during the Civil War and the 8 years following the second election of Lincoln. And then the third one was the Harper's Bazaar, which was America's first fashion magazine. And that again reflected a recognition that a growing consumer class that reflected the Gilded Age would be interested in fashion. And they were the first one to kind of put that fashion magazine out there for the masses across the country. But they were also brave publishers. And before the Civil War, Harper's Weekly took a very moderate editorial position on slavery so as not to upset its Southern readers. But when the Civil War broke out, it fully supported Abraham Lincoln and the Union. And in 1863, it published this very famous picture. It was an etched photo of the escaped slave Gordon. And it was famous because it provided readers in the North their kind of first visual evidence of the brutality of slavery. And I think it reflected the Harper Brothers and Harper's Weekly willingness to take a position on what was then a very challenging social issue that would continue to echo its way through the Gilded Age and up to today, for sure. After the Civil War, Harper's Weekly supported the Republican Party and contributed to the election of Ulysses Grant. They also fully supported the radical Republican position on Reconstruction and often spoke out against the pullback of Reconstruction and the growing influence of Jim Crow at the time. As I mentioned when we began, another thing they did was they worked with a range of illustrators, including Thomas Nast, who the Weekly recruited in 1862 to be a cartoonist in the Harper's Weekly. And he was a fearless caricaturist and had been called the father of American political cartooning. And his cartoons grew national acclaim, and he was known for pillaring political boss William Tweed. He just wrote, cartoon after cartoon poking fun of him. And Tweed famously said, in his classic Tweed way, "I don't care so much what the papers write about me. My constituents can't read, but they can see those damn pictures." And those damn pictures made a real difference in how Tweed was seen, and ultimately resulted in the takedown of Tweed in the 1880s, when he was finally, those corrupt politicians were challenged. So, as I mentioned, Fletcher Harper purchased his beach lawn estate in Irvington in 1872. It was an 8.5-acre summer estate, and it included an old colonial home of 20 rooms and 5 baths and a barn and a stables. And his neighbors included James Hamilton and Nevis estate to the south, the Octagon House just to the west, and the Wendell homestead across Clinton Avenue to the north, where the Murray estate was in many later years. And again, Fletcher Harper and then Fletcher Harper's son used this estate on a regular basis, both as a summer estate and throughout the year. And on the left is a picture of Fletcher Harper, and on the right, the Fletcher Harper Jr. And Fletcher Harper died in 1877 in New York City. And by this time, his son, Fletcher Harper, had stepped in and taken over the periodicals. So he continued in the same tradition of promoting these periodicals, a way of reaching out to the reading public in the United States. And he continued to take a leading role in the firm until health issues took him over. And as I said, Fletcher Harper Jr., his Fletcher Harper's wife, Margaret, and I'm Fletcher Harper Jr.'s wife, Margaret, and then his mother, Jane Freelove Harper, continued to own and use the beach lawn estate in Irvington for many years. The Harpers also reflected another aspect of the Gilded Age, and that was how philanthropic activities went on. And Fletcher Harper Jr.'s wife, Margaret Cook Harper, founded the Harper Industrial School on Ludlow Street in New York City, which operated for many years. And she also founded the Harper Seashore Cottage for Working Girls in Long Branch, New Jersey, which was a summer retreat for also working girls or young women from the New York streets. And in the late 1880s, many Americans embraced the concept of industrial schools as an effort to train and reform children who were typically from immigrant or working class backgrounds, to kind of offer them vocational training intended to introduce them and develop them for society. And in some cases, the communities where these industrial schools embraced them, but sometimes they did not, and saw them as kind of a paternalistic way to train and assimilate children in what the reformers thought was the proper way to behave, rather than what the local communities thought them to do. So they could often be very controversial kinds of places. But this was very much the Harper's philosophy, and Margaret Harper was very big proponent of this. And she, as I mentioned, often every summer would bring young women who were working as teenagers and bring them out to the working girls' seashore cottage in Long Branch for several weeks in the summer. And she was also very involved in the Women's Hospital in New York City. Margaret Cook Harper died in 1886, and after Fletcher Harper's death in 1890 and his mother's death in 1895, the beach lawn estate was eventually taken over by a bank and sold. So again, let's reflect on the Harper family, another large name in Irvington's history, and how they reflect in the Gilded Age. As I said, they were strong advocates for technological changes to the publishing business, and that was emblematic of the changes to industry going on. They developed and successfully marketed weekly and monthly magazines that reached a wide market of homes across the country. Through Harper's Weekly magazine, they created a platform for political commentary that really challenged vested political and business interests, and they were fearless in doing this. And it was at a time where a growing awareness of inequality and things that had to be challenged, and the Harper Weekly, especially the Harper Weekly, was at the forefront of that. And then through the serialization of new work in the Harper's new monthly magazine, they, as I mentioned earlier, they introduced a new range of American authors and contemporary fiction to the broader country. And then through their personal philanthropy, the Harpers reflected both the positive and the negative sides of wealthy families seeking to help the destitute poor at the time. So the final group of folks I want to talk about are an interesting crew of individuals. There are three of them: Thomas Burns, William Murray, and John McCullough. And this again is a map from the original map, the 1891 map, and this shows Sunnyside Park, which was an area east of Broadway, just south of today's Harriman Road. It was called Park Avenue back then. And this was one of the first kind of developed communities in the new Irvington community. And it was originally conceived by Charles Harriman, who was a real estate investor who originally was going to invest in Irvington, bought a bunch of property, and then decided to invest in Yonkers instead, and eventually sold this property, including Sunnyside Park, to two brothers, George and Charles Palliser, who were architects in Bridgeport, Connecticut, who were well known for selling low-cost designs for architectural designs. And they also had this grand plan of developing Sunnyside Park and building it in. They planned to build 50 stone mansions for New York City's merchants and bankers, etc. But they also ran into problems, and eventually their company went to receivership. But in 1891, they had sold off a number of these properties, including the ones in two parcels, 1 and 7, in the upper left corner of Sunnyside Park, which the map shows were owned at that time by Superintendent William Murray. So who are these folks? As I said, in September of 1890, the receiver for the Palliser Company that owned Sunnyside Park sold parcels number 1 to the New York City Police Department Inspector Thomas F. Burns. This was the first step in this process, and his wife Ophelia Burns for $8,000. Now, $8,000 was a substantial sum in 1890, especially for a police department inspector or detective such as Inspector Burns. Burns never had a salary more than $5,000 a year, and he had no known relationship with Irvington. So there's a reason. This quickly adds a question: is why were he and his wife buying these large pieces of property for $8,000, substantial sum, in a community that they had no connection with? 5 months later, Burns turned around and resold those two parcels to Sarah Murphy, who was the wife of New York Police Department Superintendent William Murray, also for $8,000. And William Murray as well had no relationship to Irvington. And while he was the police superintendent, that was still a lot of money. And so why Burns, the inspector, flipped it to Murray, the superintendent. But then 3 months later, Murray's wife, Sarah Murray, again sold the same parcels 1 and 2 to Police Inspector John McCullough for $8,000. So John McCullough was a longtime resident of Irvington. He had immigrated as a 11-year-old with his family from County Tyrone, Ireland, the new village of Dearman. And as I mentioned, none of these police officers, other than McCullough, had any connection to Irvington, never built anything on this property, and apparently just held it as an investment. So what's kind of the story behind all of this? So let's look at that, because I think it reflects another theme of the Gilded Age as reflected here in Irvington. So the first step in the chain, as I mentioned, was the sale of the property to Thomas Burns and his wife, Ophelia. So Burns was born in Ireland in 1842 and came to New York City with his family as an infant. He served in the Civil War and then returned to New York and joined the police force in 1863. And then as a rookie policeman, kind of made his name when he saved a superior officer. And he quickly rose to the ranks, becoming captain in 1870, inspector in 1880, the head of detective bureau in 1882, where he really made his name, and became superintendent in 1892. And he was known to be very tough on criminals and boasted of having invented the third degree, which was a very harsh interrogation technique. And he had an interesting connection to Jay Gould, who obviously owned Lyndhurst at this time. In 1872, Burns was the lead investigator in the death of James Fisk, who was Gould's partner. And Fisk had been shot by a guy named Edward Stokes after Stokes had taken up with Fisk's longtime mistress, Joseph Manfield. This had been a very public libel trial going on and all over the newspapers at the time. And the day Stokes testified, 2 hours later, he found Fisk and shot him dead, or shot him in a hotel. And because Fisk was the investigator, through this, he kind of befriended Gould, who came to be by Fisk's bedside as Fisk was dying. And Burns famously first tried to interrogate Stokes, and Stokes wouldn't answer any questions. So Fisk then went down to the hotel where Fisk had been shot. I mean, Burns went down to the hotel where Fisk had been shot and took a deathbed statement from him where he identified Stokes as his killer. And this connected him up with Gould. And Gould developed a lot of other relations with other businessmen as well on Wall Street by aggressively investigating individuals who threatened the wealthy for money, or more often threatened businessmen because of affairs they were having. Burns later testified to a Senate Lexo committee, a New York State Senate committee, that he and Gould had been great friends, and that Gould had just invested on his behalf a lot of money in railroad stocks and real estates, and made Burns a very wealthy man. Now, this is a police inspector in New York City. And Burns ultimately became the best example of corruption in the New York City Police Department. And he was ultimately fired for corruption by Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt. The second step in the chain, as I mentioned, was Sarah Murray, who was the wife of Inspector William F. Murray. And William Murray and Thomas Burns had been longtime close friends. They'd served in the Civil War together. And while Murray was superintendent, a grand jury concluded that there was widespread corruption in the ranks under his supervision. And he was ultimately compelled to retire in 1892 as well because of these corruption concerns. Superintendent Murray's name came up in a big investigation involving payoffs involving fixed boxing matches at Madison Square Garden. The third step in the chain, as I mentioned, was that the sale of these two parcels to Captain Farmer John McCullough. And McCullough had also immigrated from Ireland, from Northern Ireland, what today's Northern Ireland, to the new village of Dearman with his family as a young boy. He attended school as a boy in Irvington and joined the New York Police Department in 1864. And he was married to Isabella McCullough, and they had 3 children. And he had grown up in Irvington, was prominent in all athletic sports and games, and he joined the police force in 1864 at the age of 22. And then at the age of 1868, age of 26, he purchased a lot on the west side of Fair Street for $800 and immediately flipped it for $1,520. And it's kind of a remarkable transaction at the time. At that point, he was a roundsman, which was kind of a police sergeant, and his salary was very small. And where he came up with the money was unclear. But at that time, he was assigned also to Grand Central Station and would meet a lot of bankers coming into Grand Central Station and purportedly built relationships with them. And he had many firm and influential friends. And then while he was living in New York City in 1879, he purchased some lots on South Continent Street and a couple of adjacent lots for a couple of $1,000s, again, a fairly large sum. Then they purchased additional lots on Main Street and Continent for about another $5,000. Again, amount of money that his salaries at the time would not have justified at all. In 1889, John McCullough and his wife built a 2.5-story brick home, one of the larger residences in the main part of the village. And that is on South Continent Street. You'll see in this map, C is Continent, B is Buckout, and on the right, that's Main Street. And this large brick house is here still in Irvington today. It's called the Blue Rock. It's the second house in on South Continent on the west side. And then 2 years later, they bought parcels 1 and 7 on Sunnyside for another $8,000. So somewhere, somehow, he was getting a lot of money. So how did this all happen? Well, I don't know for sure. I've not been able to find out exactly, but some interesting connections. First, unlike many Irish immigrants of the time, McCullough was a Presbyterian. He was not a Catholic. He was a member of the Fifth Avenue Presbyterian Church and a close friend of Reverend John Hall. Now, Reverend John Hall was also a close associate of Jay Gould and Gould's daughter, Helen, who lived in Lyndhurst. And they were both supporters of the Presbyterian Church, both in Irvington and New York City. And as a property owner in Irvington, McCullough likely attended the Irvington Presbyterian Church, where Gould was a pew holder, and they knew each other from that. And the transactions involving parcels number 1 and 7 on Harriman Road originally went to Burns. Well, Gould had been Burns' financer, and this could have been an effort by Gould to pass this property through first Burns and then Murray to McCullough to be able to land this very valuable property in John McCullough's hands. So again, let's just talk about for a second Burns and Murray and McCullough as a reflection of the Gilded Age. Both Burns and McCullough lived as Irish immigrants. They lived the Irish immigrant experience, arrived in the United States as children just prior to the Civil War. All three joined the New York City police force at the close of the Civil War, when the police force was going through a lot of changes, and they navigated the challenges of a fast-growing and quickly changing industrial city, all the racial and religious tensions and wealth inequality. And notwithstanding their limited salaries as police officers, Burns, Murray, and McCullough were able to get a lot of wealth and invest in real estate and stocks, apparently with the silent assistance of wealthy patrons. And I think that in many ways reflected the corruption in the New York City Police Department, and reflected the wider political corruption in New York City government and the wider corruption in the Gilded Age as a whole. So let me just finish up. What I've tried to do today is talk about some people who I think are very interesting in Irvington and tie it back to the Gilded Age. As I said, we have a Gilded Age exhibit at the McVickar House, which if you've not seen, I recommend highly you to go to. It's open on Thursdays from 1 to 4 and Saturdays from 1 to 4, because it also brings out and highlights a lot of the things that from the Society's collection about the Gilded Age. And it's a great thing to do. So with that, I'm going to end. Thanks to Gail Weiler, who is the curator of the Gilded Age exhibit, and to Mark Donovan, who you probably know runs a blog about estates in Irvington. I've done other things with Mark as well. So just thanks to both of them. So let's see if we have any questions in the chat, and we'll take some questions. So I'm going to stop the share. Let me open up the chat. Okay. So how come no discussion of Jay Gould, who bought Lyndhurst? That's one question. Well, I did mention Jay Gould, but we actually, as I said, I chose the 5 people I did, but we actually just did a talk about Jay Gould. Greg Steinmetz, who wrote a recent book about Jay Gould called, I think, The Art of the Rascal. I have it right here, if I'm not mistaken. American Rascal. He did a talk, and we've recorded that, and that's on the Irvington website, Irvington Historical Society website. So you can watch that and learn all about Jay Gould. And as I said, I actually think Jay Gould's hands played into the money that flowed to John McCullough to both perhaps buy the property in Harriman and potentially buy the property on South Continent where he built Blue Rock. And let's see, let me read another question. Just more, it said, I moved to a town on the North Shore of Long Island in 1970. The town had many small businesses. For many decades, it services the very large estates. The owners of these businesses reported that the owners of the estates frequently did not pay their bills, sometimes for years, requiring the business owners to take out loans from small banks. Do you find any stories about this problem in Irvington? Here and there, there was I think the grocery store that George Dearman operated was one of the many. There was several grocery stores in Irvington at the time, but there are reports at the time that they often had to press to get some of their bills paid by the larger estate owners. Another dynamic, which I mentioned earlier on, was in the Dearman family. The Dearman family had used James Hamilton, who was obviously a very wealthy lawyer who lived in Nevis, as the executors of Justice Dearman's estate and George W. Dearman's estate. But they ran into problems between the needs of their George W. Dearman's widow, Euphemia Dearman, her children, and getting James Hamilton's attention. So I pulled out the estate files for George Dearman, and there's all these battles between the Dearman family and James Hamilton about when they could get money, when they could not. And I think it reflected the kinds of challenges that between these different parts of the community, between some of the large wealthy landowners, the businessmen along Main Street that serviced them, and in many ways the immigrants who were workers on these various states. So another question is, were the schools at that time actually located in Irvington, including the high school? Well, the schools in Irvington were actually, there were schools in Irvington at the time, but they were not located where they are now. When Irvington was first formed in 1850, there was a small school opened on Broadway, actually just south of Main Street, where kind of where the Red Hat, not the Red Hat, but the River City Grill is, right about there. That was a schoolhouse there. And then there was a school opened on North Ferris Street, where the current gymnasium for the Main Street School. That was a schoolhouse, which for many years was a schoolhouse in Irvington. There was another small schoolhouse for a period of time at the corner of Sunnyside and Broadway. And so schoolhouses moved around, and then ultimately the Main Street School was built on Main Street. And then in the 1960s, they built the high school and the campus up on North Broadway. So they've shifted around over the years for sure. So let me see what else I've got here. Which house was owned by Fargo? Is it still there? I believe it is. When Fargo owned it, it was called Lindenholm. Actually, I don't know whether the original house that was owned by Fargo is still there. It's if you go up Fargo Lane, after Fargo sold his property, his 40-acre estate was actually divided up into different smaller estates. And I don't remember sitting here today whether his estate or his summer home was called Lindenholm survived all that stuff. I've looked at all that history, but I just don't remember off the top of my head. But there are other houses that were owned at the time that are still around. Let's see, other questions. When did Dearman become Irvington? So Dearman, when Franklin Field started selling off these lots in Dearman in April of 1850, it was called either Dearman or Dearman Hamlet or Dearman Stop. And then in 1854, two friends of Washington Irving, who was still alive and living in Sunnyside at the time, decided that they wanted to honor Washington Irving by renaming the new village of Dearman, the new village of Irvington, if they could. And so George Morgan went to his brother, Edward Morgan, who was which was which, but one of them went to the postmaster to get the postmaster to change the post office near the train station to have that become the Irvington post office. And then another person went to the owner of the New Hudson River Railroad to get them to name the stop Irvington and to have the schedules say that it's Irvington. So from that point on, about 1854, the village started to become known as Irvington. And then when it was incorporated in 1872, it was incorporated as the village of Irvington. So another question, location, could you please review the location of the Dutcher farm? So the Dutcher farm, which was part of which was formed to create the village of Irvington. Originally, it was a larger farm. It was about a 230 or 40 acre farm owned by William Dutcher, who purchased it. His father purchased it right after the Revolutionary War, and it extended from kind of in today, where the northern part of the Main Street area of Irvington, up to about halfway up Broadway towards Sunnyside, and it extended from the Hudson River out to the Sawmill River. In 1812, William Dutcher sold the southern half of that farm, which was about 144 acres, to Justice Dearman, and that's what became. So actually, the Dutcher farm actually extended down to the southern border of the main part of Irvington. So what is Field Point today, that also would have been part of the original Dutcher farm. That became the Dearman farm. And when Justice Dearman sold the western half to start the new village of Dearman, he sold the eastern half, which is where the Field Point is today, actually sold it to John McVickar, who was planning to build a new college there, but ultimately did not build that college. And ultimately the college he envisioned was started as Bard College in upstate New York. Let's see. Was James Hamilton a descendant of Alexander Hamilton? He was. He was Alexander Hamilton's son. So he named his estate Nevis after the island Nevis, where his father Alexander Hamilton was born. And James Hamilton was a kind of a well-known person in his own right. He was a lawyer, was a U.S. attorney for the Southern District for a period of time, and worked in the government for a short period of time as well. And then one final question, were the servants and workers on these estates English and Irish and later Italian immigrants? They were. There were a mixture of English, German, Irish, and then later Italian immigrants that migrated to the kind of area along Main Street, the area along Eastern Clinton Avenue, which was called Abbotsville at the time, then the area out where East Irvington is, which was called Little Dublin. It was a very Italian and Irish part of it. And we are actually holding our next exhibit after the Gilded Age will be one about immigrants in Irvington. That's going to be something that's going to probably open in the fall. And we'll probably have some talks about that at the same time as well. So look, I've been talking for quite a while, and I think we need to stop. But I wanted to do a couple things. I wanted to, thank you all for coming today, to encourage you to go visit the McVickar House and see the Gilded Age exhibit. And I just wanted to highlight for you quickly some upcoming talks we're going to be doing as well. In April 30th, the Girl Scouts in Irvington will be doing a presentation. It'll be a live presentation about Isabel Benjamin, who was a long-standing person here in the village, and she was the mover and shaker and created the Girl Scout system here in Irvington. That's going to be at the St. Barnabas Episcopal Church. And then we are also going to be doing a talk by Pat Bonamy, who is on the board of the Historical Society, on May 21st on kind of the colonial New York as a model for America today. And then on May 31st, we're going to be doing a program of Tomorrow's Historians, where Irvington High School students are going to be presenting some of the papers they wrote about history and and we're not quite sure where that's going to be yet, but we'll let people know. It'll be up on our website. So with that, I think we're going to finish up for today. I want to thank everybody for coming, and I appreciate it, and I hope it was interesting. If people have questions, feel free to email me or email the Historical Society at info@irvingtonhistoricalsociety.org. So thank you very much and enjoy this beautiful day. Thanks.